But when you read the New Testament in the full context, there's more bad news. It's not just sin and death. It's sin, death, and God's election. Like that's bad news. If God is electing some and not others.
This is an efficient way to speak of God when you're speaking of mercy and grace. Those are basically dispositional metonyms. And the question is, why would you sum him up with mercy and grace when the lion's share of humanity is actually being lost? Like all of Central and South America and North America, for thousands of years, for millennia.
As a Christian, did that make you feel more loved, more special, more grateful, more? Because it's supposed to provoke that in you, right? It's supposed to produce that in you.
What America is supposed to be about is the land of opportunity. If you describe America,
I agree with that.
Okay, but what we have now, we have a situation where the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. So there's a lot that has to be done, and the goal is to create a nation that works for all of us, not just the 1%.
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt, but rather than complain about the 1% or the 0.1%, why not make the rest of America and put them into the 1%?
Well, if you put everybody into the 1%, they wouldn't be the 1%.
Well, no, it still would be.
No, it wouldn't be.
If I can.
The rest of the population, by definition, they're not in the 1% if they're the rest of the population.
But
all of the population is 100%.
All right. So this is simple math. If you have 1% here, 1%, you have 99.
Yeah.
And if you move the 9 in there, you have 19. And then you move the other 9 there.
Well,
if you believe in equality, why not have 100% of people in the 1%? These aren't my figures. This is the International Institute of Scientific Truth and Knowledge. So this has been proven that this can work.
No.
This might lead to some increase in the deficit, but essentially it is possible.
What is your proposal, Lee?
That you keep the 1%, but you move the 99% into the 1%. You have 199. You just move over the 9s. You have the 99% are in the 1%.
Billy, I don't know what you're talking about. I really don't.
Oh gosh. So fellas, this is the classic debate between Arminians and Calvinists. If you ask me, that's one way we could look at this.
Are we about to solve the millennium old debate here tonight?
Yeah. It's the problem of the ages. But you can see our Sacha Baron Cohen character here would represent basically your Arminian view, right? He would represent the view of people in this scheme who are trying to see if they can make it equal for everyone.
Well, not necessarily, because the Arminian view is not appealing to God to move the 99 into the 1%. The Arminian view is appealing to the 99% to put themselves in the 1%.
Yeah, but okay, so I see what you're saying, but what I'm talking about specifically is when you start talking about election and predestination and who if we looked at the atonement, for instance, and how far reaching is the propitiation that Christ made for sin? Like, how far reaching is it? The Arminian would generally say that this is a very extensive atonement that's being offered, that the salvation that
everybody can get
work. Yeah, that the work of redemption is one that makes it available to all. And the Calvinist is quite exclusive with that. The Calvinist is saying, like, no. There's no surplus. Like they don't believe in they don't believe in leftovers when it comes to the cross, right? What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, that's pretty good. They don't like the notion that there was any kind of predetermined thing at all, right? That there was some agency going on when it comes to them deciding to, become a Christian.
It's interesting because a lot of Calvinists will trace their lineage back to Augustine, and Augustine's view on election was that God's predestination was based in his foreknowledge. It was based in him knowing what you were going to choose later, which is quite a bit different than the contemporary Calvinist feels. But we'll get into that in a little bit. But one of the ways that people look at election is that it's such a it's such a harsh doctrine is probably the way I would put it. The idea that a person outside of their own volition would be determined for perdition or for salvation. That is such a harsh reality for people to accept, that it has to have its origins in something divine. But right now, I just want to just talk a little about that whole idea that you hear arguments sort of like this being made for Christianity in other ways too. I've heard. I'd like to bounce that off of you guys and see if you guys recall being in circles and people saying like, "See, this is so counterintuitive to human nature that it has to find its origins outside of humanity." Does that ring a bell? Do you guys remember hearing this sort of thing?
Yeah, I remember. There's a lot that we can say to that. I think I'll hold off a little bit on talking about some experiences with kind of reading scripture here and there, but I think I do remember a very striking moment when I was I think listening to Piper talk about Jonathan Edwards, and he was describing Edwards' experience about how he arrived at or how he met face to face with the whole doctrine of election and predestination. I think he wrote at one point that he thought it was a terrible doctrine, right? This is coming from Edwards himself. And then he, once he started to read, and read scripture and read the arguments from the Calvinist position, his perspective changed dramatically. And that's when I think the whole idea of God's sovereignty and commanding, how he controls the destiny and the trajectory of mankind, and then he was able to actually find like some way of getting solace from that. So I think, that could be kind of a story of, for a lot of people who have become a Calvinist, that's, if they ever did, that, that initially there was this kind of urge to protest against it. And I recall having a little bit of that, but not as dramatic as other people. But they do place a lot of weight on this idea that it just seems completely counterintuitive to how we might think as modern people, so to speak. So yeah.
I know for me, when I was deconverting, one of my former Bible college professors, I was asking him, how does he square certain things in the Old Testament? How does he get divine revelation out of what clearly, like, if a divine being was going to reveal anything about the creation of the heavens and the earth, like what you see in Genesis can't be true. How do you get divine revelation out of this? If God is accommodating himself to what the recipients of Scripture already understood, my question was, at what point does it stop being accommodation and become revelation of something that they could not have known? And his response was, well, I think the belief in monotheism in a polytheistic world that's something that no one would have come up with at that time because it was so out, it was so not in vogue and so out of step with what people were doing. So for them to come up talking monotheism, that alone is proof that God had to have revealed that to them. There's no way they could have done that on their own. And I just thought that was sort of specious reasoning. But for him, that was enough for him to say, aha, this must be divine.
Mm-hmm. I recall instances of people talking about the concept of grace and saying that man-made religions tend to have a way you can earn your way in, and just in a similar way saying that grace is just so counter to the human psyche that it has to be coming from somewhere else. Now, I will say with one fell swoop that it seems to me that people who have this sort of read are being very reductionistic, and that is to say that they're being very simplistic, and they're underestimating the complexity of the human brain and the ability of people to formulate systems of beliefs. Because I don't know if we pointed this out before, but human beings, for instance, are the only creature on the planet that we know of who shows their teeth as a sign of non-aggression. It's actually the opposite of the way other animals. And one might say, how is that relevant to this? It just shows you just how it's almost like you flip the game. You're so aggressive that you're not aggressive. You've crossed over to being totally benign, and that's because of the complexity of the human psychology. The way we, the way we arrive at something like that is a result of our ability to formulate very complex ways of reading things. Now, granted, some people show their teeth in anger too. They sort of grit their teeth, but the showing of one's teeth is almost universally seen as a sign of non-aggression, and it's probably because it was once considered aggression. Somehow an extreme aggression ends up canceling itself out. Just if you consider the fact that we're able to devise things like that, just think about our ability when it comes to belief systems. When you think of, well, it might seem counterintuitive that, for instance, people would develop a grace doctrine, but is it really? When you're dealing with intelligent creatures like human beings?
Right. And in a world full of works-based religions, the idea of a grace-based religion would actually be a welcomed doctrine. So is it really
Absolutely.
counterintuitive if you've probably been hoping for something like grace the entire time?
Or the notion of grace will keep you perpetually subservient. It's like if you can't ever earn your way there, you're constantly relying and repentant. You're constantly finding something to be wrong, so you always need an atonement. So it's a way to keep you in a perpetual state of repentance, and thus keep you in the religion. So I just think that people who give that argument, I'm not saying that this doesn't disprove Christianity, but it just says that they might want to dig just a little bit deeper beneath the surface and recognize that human beings are very complex. I mean, we've built societies. We have, there are all kinds of fetishes people have that are just out there. You'd be surprised the kinds of things that people would say, oh, this is counterintuitive. Well, counterintuitive is in the eye of the beholder. This idea of the improbability of whatever tenet within religion pointing to its divine origin, because of its being a fallacious notion that's based in probability, I would say that this is a twisted version of the prosecutor's fallacy. This particular pod, that is this episode, is our attempt to sit down and have a roundtable discussion about election, and just imagine it as a three-dimensional object that we're just walking around and pointing out things that we notice about it, features that we might think are interesting even, and leaving it up to the, and this isn't a, I think I saw a comment from Brady to someone, and he said, I thought it was very helpful, because the tendency is when, and some of this might be the fault of atheists, is this sort of debate mode that many people get into when we start discussing these topics. And it can be helpful to just be able to discuss things. That's one of the great benefits of leaving religion. One of the benefits of it, along with many others, is that you actually get to have these conversations openly about certain things that maybe in the past, when you were inside, they weren't really necessarily tolerated as much, and so what we're doing here, I would, at least
What was
from
the
my
comment that
view,
you
is,
saw? I don't. Did you say it?
oh yeah, and it was something, I feel, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, he's not trying to present a formal argument. This was in reference to, I believe, his last interview with Red Cloud, and he was saying this wasn't an argument. This isn't a formal debate or argument setting. He's just talking basically about his story, talking about his life, and even
Not
though
everything is a debate.
not everything's a debate, and although, like I just mentioned, a particular kind of fallacy, the goal of this particular episode isn't to debunk necessarily. I'm not saying that certain things won't be reducto ad absurdums, etc. But this is not. I wouldn't say the primary goal of this episode is to have a person come in here believing in election and leave not believing in it. I just think it's very helpful for human beings to be able to have open communication and dialogue about things like this. What do you guys think?
I think this applies even to how we talked about, right, apologetics, because it's a very multifaceted discussion, and it relates to, like this topic of election, it relates to a lot of questions about philosophy as well as like human psychology, and I think what's kind of interesting is we're talking about a subject that not all Christians believe in, right? There are plenty of Christians who are more on the semi-Pelagian side, maybe even on the Pelagian side. I think having a conversation about this, I think for us it's particularly poignant because we have been in those circles that believe in, that have more predestinarian view. I have been engaged in plenty of debates back in my Christian days against free will libertarians, and trying to convince them of but I obviously I don't do that now, but I think it's it's a story that has a rich history with individuals and academically with lots of thinkers, and even today we have Sam Harris, who as an atheist believes in determinism, right? And and he has a very compelling kind of argument and case for how he argues that point. So I think this whole question, I mean, the reason why the movie The Matrix was so fascinating, I think, was partly this free will versus
you're getting ahead of us here.
All right. Okay, got it. Okay, got it. I won't do that.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Right.
Yeah. I think it's a worthwhile conversation. I think it's a worthwhile conversation in that as ex-believers, we get to look at it from a vantage point that we, as Christians, we just had to accept it as Christians.
Right.
Now we kind of get to look at it and say what we really think about it. You know what I mean? And so, I'm looking forward to just being able to ask questions and not have to accept certain things. Just say that that's weird. That doesn't make sense. Or um, I think it's therapeutic even for other believers who are wrestling with things. To hear somebody bring up a point where they get to just say, maybe as a believer I can't say that, but I'm glad someone else said it. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I honestly think there's a sense in which you listeners can take this as the hot mic episode. I don't know if you guys are familiar with these episodes in popular culture where
Hmm.
it'll be occasionally you'll see there was a news a reporter and they had a hot mic and they said something about their coworker and they I feel like the Christian
Right.
if you could envision yourself as a Christian with a hot mic, just allow us to be the hot mic where your invasive thoughts get to be expressed. I think one of the greatest examples of that is I think it was Robert Durst, who was the convicted murderer, who at some point in the documentary about him, he had a hot mic. He had a mic. He went to the bathroom and he's like, "Yeah, I basically killed them all," and the mic picked it up. So it's like you just consider this pod for the Christian, that is like a hot mic kind of like where
I'm thinking of the scene in The Naked Gun when Leslie Nielsen goes into the bathroom and then he starts singing.
was it similar?
Yeah, it's the same exact scenario.
Yeah, for sure. So that would be a good pod name. We're already Ichabod, but the hot mic.
I was thinking
be
that.
interesting.
I was thinking that.
Oh, you were. Wow.
Yeah.
When
When you said you were
as soon
thinking
as,
of that before,
as Jay Witt started breaking it down.
yeah.
No, no,
Yeah.
no. When you started breaking it down.
It's an interesting concept, yeah. But let's get into the history of Christian predestinarian thought. Albert it gave
Okay.
us a great segue into this by mentioning, I think he said semi-Pelagian, and some people put what? So it's like Pelagius was a Romano-British theologian known for promoting a system of doctrines termed Pelagianism by his opponents, which emphasized human choice in salvation and denied original sin. Actually, that little blurb is from Wikipedia. So if you want to read more on him, you could just hit Wikipedia up, and I just aggregated a couple biographical notes on these guys just so people could have an understanding. So Pelagian, or people might say Arminian. Some people speak of Arminian. Most of these systems of thoughts are named after actual individuals, like Arminius or Pelagius, and these are people who are earlier on in the church history. Now, you shouldn't think that these individuals initiated they're the progenitors of these ideas. They just are people who, for whatever reason, were controversial enough to have the idea to be associated with them, and thus the nomenclature. But if you look into the text, you'll see the reason why this is an issue is because the text in several places speaks about these things, and it speaks about them from. It's actually interesting. We're doing this roundtable. We're walking around the sculpture and looking at it, and the text is very much like that. Sometimes it'll seem to be indicating a more Pelagian sort of idea or something, or Arminian, I should say. And then other times you'll look and you'll see something that looks Augustinian. Augustine, on the other hand, taught that God orders all things while preserving human freedom. Prior to 396, he believed predestination. I'm going to say that again. Prior to 396, he believed predestination was based on God's foreknowledge, or whether individuals would believe in Christ. That God's grace was a reward for human assent. Now, that's what I referred to earlier. And the implication there is that after 396, his view changed. So what do you guys have to say about that? Just the history. We don't have to dwell on this that long, but what do you guys think?
I'm thinking of there were several years in my uh, Christian life where I was a Calvary Chapel churchgoer, And I remember Joe Foch, Pastor Joe Foch, those in Philly know Joe. He was talking about the way the church believes and the way the church preaches. And I think it was even written up in a Calvary Chapel perspective. And it said, some days, some days they're going to sound like full-fledged Arminians. Other days they're going to sound like staunch Calvinists as they walk through the text, verse by verse. And I just remember, like, as a Christian, I just took that as, wow, look at how biblical they are. Look at how committed they are to the text. But now when I look back, I'm like, man, look at how disjointed this text is. I actually have a line now that I'm thinking about it. I have a line in one of my songs. I have a song called Press On that's calling Christians to persevere because your perseverance is the way that God ensures your salvation. And then I have a line in the song where I say, I go from one verse to the other, one Bible verse to the other, talking about whether it's your responsibility or God's responsibility to keep you saved. And then there's a line where I sum it up and I say, if it sounds like I'm talking out both sides of my neck, I'm not. I'm talking out both sides of the text. So watch. And I don't know why, as a believer, I thought that was so honorable, but now I'm just like, man, that should have been a red flag. Talking out of both sides of the text. Like, what? But when you go back and you look at the history of Augustine saying, hey, maybe it's God's foreknowledge that allows him to see who's going to choose him, and then he chooses them based on that. But wait, is it foreknowledge if he's waiting for them to choose first? You see these ideas about human responsibility, but God's sovereignty. And then, like you said before, Jay, we chalk it up to mystery. But what does that mean? Is it really mystery, or is the mystery you have these humans saying different things, and then they leave it up to church history for the next umpteen thousand years to work it all out?
Yeah, that brings to mind it was a sermon I heard back in the day, and it was called Air Conditioning. You guys, I know you probably like that one, Brady. It's the double entendre there, where it was air, but it wasn't. It was air spelled as HEIR, and he was coming from Hebrews 3:14, and where he says, "We know we've come to share in Christ if we hold our original conviction or whatever to the end." And so he was saying how just consider how almost intellectual but so convoluted it is to have a sentence like that, where he's like, you've come to share in Christ if you hold firm to the end. So so you're simultaneously showing that you have this sort of you being an inheritor or an heir of this thing that you've been predestined unto, but you're in the same verse, there's an emphasis on you holding on. You see what I mean? So, and this is why a lot of Reformed people will talk about these paradoxes. But go ahead.
Well, that just made me think of 1 Timothy 2, where Paul talks about why women cannot lead men, because Eve was deceived and not Adam, and Adam was made first. And then he says, but women shall be saved through childbirth if they continue in faith and modesty and holiness. So wait a minute, where does the election and predestination, where does that fit in this scheme of, first of all, they have to they're going to be saved through childbirth. And then even in that case, only if they continue in these things.
Yeah, and then you have the word saved itself, which it's a passive word. If you have been saved, someone has saved you. Right. You see, so a lot of Reformed people lean heavily into that kind of language and saying, "Hey, is it really salvation if you're not if you're doing something to, you're not being saved, you're saving yourself, So yeah, these are just this again. We'll pause here and note that these are just interesting. This is a intellectual endeavor, like having a system of belief set up like this. That's weighty enough for you to tease out all of these other. This is why I have a habit of not finishing my thoughts, but having something that you can take and it's multifaceted. It's like those. I remember my mother used to have a crystal when we were a kid, and you had all of these planes on the crystal, and you could turn it on. And as a child, you just be fascinated, just turning it in the light and seeing. When you have something that's this multifaceted, it gives you something to intellectual. And I would actually even challenge the believers, consider sometimes, and I'm hearing the interlocutors already. I can hear them saying, yeah, see, this is why you were never a believer. You found it a curiosity. You were just interested in the intellectual element. You never were regenerate. But consider, to those believers who ponder these sorts of things, and really kind of get your intellectual gut filled while you're pondering, just consider that this is a beautiful thing that humans are able to contrive things that are complex enough to just gain a certain kind of intellectual pleasure from. Now, this is aside from it being its veracity. This has to do with just human beings coming up with systems that are complex. And if we can make airplanes, and we can make spaceships, if we can make boats that are huge and heavy float, just imagine in theology, why would people think that it's so simple that, that's not something that we would naturally be inclined, so it can't be of human origin? Of course we are capable of creating the theological equivalent to a Boeing airplane, right? I mean, can I get an amen from the other side? I mean, right? I mean, doesn't it strike you as being likely that we could do this?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this whole discussion, because I feel like people who are not in religion, and I would love to see if there is some kind of research sample that you can take, but I don't think people outside of religion often think about this question between free will and determinism. And then it so happens when you come into religion, when you put some kind of supernatural ontological being, then it becomes a little more a little more, they not only think about it more, but people tend to have an opinion about it more. And I think that's interesting, but also just this whole idea of maybe in that scheme, it's a little easier to conceptualize of reasons as to why you think one thing is just absurd or unfair. Because you have these kind of theological categories in mind. But that's not to say, right? I think to your point, Jay Witt, that just because we can't think of any reasons why X that can exist or shouldn't exist, doesn't make it so in that way. So the whole it kind of relates to the whole fact of the unbelief through incredulity, essentially. So but yeah, I think I that's an amen. Basically, it's a long way of saying yes, amen to what you just said.
Yeah, I think it's very it's very important that we establish now. We're not pioneers in this regard, but even so on the inside you have serious theological thought. I mean, I remember reading John Owen and Jonathan Edwards and Van Til and even some Bavinck. Some of these guys are serious intellectual individuals, and this, even as a non-believer, I threw out a lot of my Christian books, but I did keep the Jonathan Edwards volumes just because, just in terms of the literary value, regardless of what he's actually trying to get you to believe, it had some value just intellectually, just in terms of, this is why sometimes I still will quote from the KJV, that is the King James Version, just because of the way it's written. It's got a beautiful poetry. So I don't want things to always be reduced. I think there's a certain reductionism that people come to these topics, and it's just, they try to boil it down to only matters of veracity or the lack thereof. And whether a thing is true or not is one thing, but whether a thing is interesting is another thing. So I think these conversations can be fruitful and helpful, maybe in that latter category of just being, sometimes it's just interesting to talk about. I mean, if you're a curious person, some people might say, hey,
let me ask you, you're saying that, but at the same time, you wanted to title this episode Election Fraud. So interesting as it may be, there does seem to be a certain
provocateur. That's just me being a provocateur. That's all. It's simple clickbait. It's clickbait. Don't press that too hard. I mean, I couldn't resist it. I mean, the phrase it's basically been in the air for the last several years, and you start talking about election, you just got to couple it with fraud. But I mean, of course, there's a little bit of it's a little cheeky, but for sure. But I'm just saying, like, yeah, I just think
hopefully we'll get some clicks of people who click on this video thinking it's a Trump video, and it's not.
Yeah. We're just trying to pull you into the discussion, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. I mean, these things are interesting, and like Albert pointed out, some of these things you can kind of strip them of the religion, and they can be fairly irreligious, but you still have to deal with a certain degree of determinism, even if you don't have a God or whatever. And even if you don't have a telos, you still have the issue of determinism. Now, I jotted down a quick thought. If God is capable of saving individuals through natural revelation, the scheme of saving individuals through special revelation is extraordinarily inefficient. However, if he is not, the great mass of humanity, which is consequently devoted to destruction, is perhaps even more inefficient, unless he's a God whose attributes of hate and wrath are more fitting dispositional metonyms than that of mercy and grace. And this is all to say that often when Christians speak of God, they speak of him a God of loving kindness and mercy. And the way that you're going to see how this relates to the next step. If you consider the mass of humanity that ends up being damned as a result of him, of double predestination is the term theologically for it, but that is him predestinating their damnation. What did Christ say? Broad is the way that leads to destruction, but narrow is the way that leads to life, and few there be that find it. If the idea is that the objects of mercy and grace are few, as opposed to the broad, the mass of people, why is it that the metonyms that we use to describe him dispositionally, that is in terms of like attitudinally, why do we speak of him as being a merciful and gracious God when a metonym? Oh, okay. So you speak of things that are associated with a thing that more or less sum the thing up. So you could speak of
give an example.
You might have some people getting really technical with this, but because you have other words like synecdoche and stuff that are nearly synonyms to this. But you might speak of the crown to speak of the reign of the king or something, but it's an object that you associate with the king that you can then speak of it to sum up everything.
Or take your hand in marriage. Take your hand in marriage, right? What does the word hand mean in that phrase?
Yeah, give me a hand. Yeah, give me a hand.
Right.
And it's like you don't mean literally give me a hand, So, and a lot of comedy sometimes is based in taking these sorts of phrases really, really seriously and taking them to absurd, places. But you get what I'm saying. So when I speak of a disposition,
so basically taking a part for the whole.
Right.
Exactly.
Well,
So
that would
when
be
we,
a synecdoche. That would be a synecdoche, but a metonym can also, and metonym can be that, but it can also be other things as well. If that makes any
exactly.
sense.
So you have the synecdoche, you have
Something
the
that's associated
metonym,
with
and you
it.
have
Right.
yeah.
Correct.
But when you speak of a disposition,
Mm-hmm.
this is an efficient way to speak of God when you're speaking of mercy and grace. Those are basically dispositional metonyms. And the question is, why would you sum him up with mercy and grace when the lion's share of humanity is actually being lost? Like all of Central and South America and North America, for thousands of years, for millennia, these people were outside now. And
So let me go,
about,
Jay Witt, let me respond to that. So the Christian might say, or the Calvinist might respond and say, well, it God is already dealing with a perverse, a rebellious, humanity, right? That has the noetic effects of the fall, the corrupted nature, that all comes from original sin. So it's not that anything, like he doesn't have any responsibility or any means or any prerogative to do, or not he has prerogative, but he doesn't he doesn't owe humanity anything, or even the elect, and he chooses to give them, extends his saving means, etc. How would you respond to that? Or I guess that would be the
I'd like to respond to that, if I could.
Okay.
Jay Witt, you made a brilliant point, but I feel like it's going to go over the head of the audience. So I think in responding to Albert's question, I'd like to break it down. Like when we talk about these metonyms, these taking things that are associated with something else and then using that thing to speak of that other thing, it makes sense to use a metonym that is like, you don't have a king without a crown. And when you see the crown, you think of the king. Like it's such a fitting metonym because kings and crowns go together. It would be a poor metonym to associate, um, I don't know, think of something that is tangentially related to kings. Um, a carriage, right? Kings might ride in a carriage drawn by a horse, but that's so tangential to what a king is. And other people can ride in a carriage.
Mm-hmm.
So a carriage would not be a fitting metonym for a king. A crown would. To take someone's hand in marriage is a fitting metonym because when you get married, you put a ring on a finger and the hand, to take someone's shoe in marriage, it's not a good metonym. Even if you said, well, when you get married, you wear shoes, don't you? No, but you don't think of the shoe. You know what I mean? You think of the hand. Um, in the same way, what Jay Witt is saying is, even though we live in a world from the biblical point of view that is fallen and soaked with sin and all that, still to speak of God's mercy and grace as a fitting metonym, what Jay Witt is saying is, but when you look at the masses of humanity that will not get to experience mercy and grace, those just seem like very poor metonyms when much of the world, the majority of the world, is going to experience God's wrath.
mm-hmm.
Why aren't those the crowns, the hands in marriages, when we start trying to refer to God, since those seem to be the experience of the majority of the people on the planet Earth,
Mm-hmm.
if the Bible's rendition of salvation is true.
Yeah.
Is that fitting to say?
No, you did an excellent job summing it up, and that's taking the dense phrase of dispositional metonyms when I spoke of what I said, God whose attributes of hate and wrath are more fitting dispositional metonyms than that of mercy and grace. That's a great way to break that phrase down so that people can understand that, you have to ask yourself, listener, why is it that he is presented to us as a God of mercy and grace as opposed to hate and wrath? If those are holy attributes too, and those attributes are more used. Like his hate and wrath is finds more expression in humanity than mercy and grace. It's a worthy question, I think. And the former portion of that whole pondering that I did was addressed to people who might assume, and that's how it relates to this episode, as Arminians, and there are some people who believe that, well, God didn't just consign all of those people to wrath. He somehow reached them through natural revelation. You guys have heard this before from certain individuals who would think, well, maybe there was a way outside the cross, but then that more or less renders the cross something that's superfluous, something that's surplus in a sense. Like, what did you need the cross for?
I don't want to speed past that.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to speed past that for the person who may not have heard that before. But that's a real thing that Christians will say, because sometimes the objection to the gospel is, well, what about those who've never heard? And the Christian, if they're not a staunch Calvinist or whatever, they might say, oh, well, God's grace is sufficient. Maybe God will reveal himself to them in visions or dreams, or as what Jay Witt is talking about, maybe somehow through natural revelation, God will reveal that he exists, that they've been separated by sin, and that they somehow need a savior. Maybe God will somehow through nature lead them to those things. And that gets to what Jay Witt is saying now. Well, if God can do that, then what of the cross? But go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the statement. If God is capable of saving individuals through natural revelation, the scheme of saving individuals through special revelation is extraordinarily inefficient. That's that. But let's move to Romans 9, and I think we'll have our reader. We're gonna go Geno Jennings on him again, Albert. So come on, you bring out that radio-friendly voice. Romans 9:22. Romans 9:22.
Romans 9:22. So, what if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the object of his wrath, prepared for destruction?
Okay. Now this rhetorical question seems to imply that the scarcity of mercy is intentional, and the soteriological scheme is more about contrast. It implies that the beauty of grace needs the backdrop of tremendous wrath to be appreciated more fully. And I can't help but think of the black velvet that they bring out when they're going to show you diamond rings. It's like, in order for you to appreciate the diamond more fully, they bring out something that will contrast with it greatly, so that you could it'll stand out with greater relief. Now, what do you guys think about that? Now, this is related to the former discussion we had about the vast amount. So, if you could see all of the wrath, the object of his wrath, all of these centuries, these millennia that people were dying, according to Romans 9:22, what if, this is a rhetorical question too, so it's really not asking you. He's basically trying to teach you something here. Is this the case? Is it that the go ahead.
No, so it has the elements of scarcity, right? Things that are rare, things that are more valuable. Why was gold the first monetary basis for money? It was because of its rarity and all the other properties it had. So you're right. The Paul seems to he's pushing towards, I guess, this idea that what makes it valuable, or what makes it special, is the fact that it's not consigned to or not delegated to everyone else, but just a few.
What do you think, Brady?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think you nailed it. I remember too. We used to use, I say we, talking about cross movement, the group that I used to minister with, we used to use the analogy of the diamonds and the black cloth, not to talk about election, but to talk about the gospel, the good news of the gospel needing the backdrop of the bad news of sin and death. But when you read the New Testament in the full context, there's more bad news. It's not just sin and death. It's sin, death, and God's election. Like that's bad news. If God is electing some and not others. And I think you're right. We don't pay attention to there seems to be a intentional I mean, the only thing that saves it is the fact that Paul says, what if? So it's hypothetical. But at the same time, what if? Like, that's a scary what if. What if God has
hold on, Brady. Hold on,
chosen
Brady.
some? Yeah.
If you can hear me, hold on. Now, I'm proposing that the what if is actually, it's a rhetorical device. So, when a lot of times we speak and we use this all the time, we'll say, oh, that's a rhetorical question. Rhetorical question is a question that's full of rhetoric. It's not really intended to be a real question. And I believe that what he's doing here, I know you're right. It's almost like he understands how nasty it sounds. This is interesting. This is so interesting. It's like he understands this isn't going to go over too well. And so instead of just saying it, he poses it as a question. But the intention isn't to ask you a real question. The intention is to teach you a truth. And the truth he's trying to teach you is to say that God has chosen these people to show his wrath and make his power known. And he's bearing with great patience. He's bearing with great patience objects of his wrath that are actually being prepared to be destroyed. And that's all so that he can use them as a backdrop, as you were. I should bow out and let you finish off, Brady. I just wanted to interject. Yeah.
I hadn't read Romans 9 in a while, so I can't say for sure, but it does make sense in tone, right? The way it lines up with Paul's tone. Because I remember Romans 9 being countering the charge that God is unjust in any way, right? For judging Israel because of, the new covenant under Christ. So yes, if we're postulating that it is rhetorical, I can grant that based on kind of that tone that Paul. But I think, Jay, what you're kind of getting at here is that now that we're kind of looking at it from this angle, I'm seeing it being just like this being who just he'll just kind of go and rape and pillage 90% of the world, and then he would just claim that it's because you know what I mean. It's like so in that so there's a kind of, in a sense, it kind of nullifies this whole idea that I just talked about of like being a Christian being elected right from before the foundations of the world. It's like, okay, sure, that there is this sense of scarcity that comes with that, but when you kind of step back and look at the entire context, it does it actually justify the metonyms that we attribute to God? I think that's a great question. Yeah. it's really I never saw it that way. So
and it leads us right to our next observation, which we've pretty much been observing for the entire podcast, which is the inherent unfairness of this whole scheme. If we just backed up about 3 verses to Romans 9:19, he says, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault?" It's almost like, I can't help it. I have to pause here and note first that in 9:22, he poses a teaching moment as a rhetorical question to soften it. A couple podcasts back, we were talking about how Tim Keller was using humor to soften the blow of the doctrines that Christians had about homosexuals. So he kept interjecting humor to solve. Well, rhetorical questions are a way to soften hard truths too, because instead of presenting something as a hard fact, just both like they're easing it. It's like when you're driving and you ease onto the brake so that the whole car doesn't get jerked when you just slam the brake. So one way you can bring a person along with you rhetorically is to ask them questions that lead them and make it more a thing that they're willing to accept, because you didn't slam the brake. You see what I mean? So if we back up a couple verses, he's already in Romans 9:19, he's anticipating objections. He's like, you'll say to me then, who's going to say? The audience. Why does he still find fault? Why are they saying, why does he still find fault? Because it's unfair. That's the reason why. And he knows it is. He said, for who can resist his will? If his will is ultimately the thing that determines how things happen, then why is he still finding fault with this? And then his answer to that, we alluded to this, I believe it was in our RICO case episode. We said, but he says, who are you? He doesn't really answer. The answer to the question, well, he does answer, but he doesn't answer in a way where he's dealing with the objection. He just says, who are you, oh man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Now, when I was reading through this, I was like, wow, comparing human beings to an inert object that is on a potter's wheel, there are some serious problems. I understand they would say, well, we are like the inert, but are we really like? Because so many times he's like, the day you hear my voice, harden not your heart, and so forth. There are so many passages where he doesn't deal with you like an inert object on a potter's wheel. And so this is an almost unavoidable question. I don't want to be too long-winded here, so I want to give you guys some space to comment on this.
Well, no, I think this is a perfect place to bring in the conversation of NPCs. You have this inert object that's just being molded for whatever purpose that the potter wants. Oh, you're a vase for flowers. Oh, you're a trash can. I can do what I want with you. There's a story in the news where I think somebody beat up a kid or even stabbed a kid in a Walmart because the kid referred to this person as an NPC, a non-playable character. Basically, you're someone in this world who doesn't have a voice, who doesn't have rights, who doesn't have a story, who I don't have to care about, who I can do to you whatever I want. That's the NPC, the non-playable character. We don't have to worry about, we can run you over in Grand Theft Auto. You're not a round character, you're flat.
Brady, you're giving away our future episode.
Scripture where
you're giving away our future
no,
episode.
I'm sorry.
Right?
But I'm just saying.
But no, go ahead. Jump into it.
I'll pause there. But so I'm just saying this idea of God making all these
NPCs,
vessels to dishonor just so that the vessels of honor can say, ooh, I'm glad I wasn't one of those. Once again, that goes back to your point about, so then should grace and mercy be the things that we label this God with, if the experience of the vast majority will be something completely opposite?
And it makes me think of our RICO discussion where we talked about David, who wasn't the NPC. He's the protagonist, and he's the main player, main character. And and the rest of the Israelites who are overtaken with a plague as a result of his sin, they're the inert objects, the NPCs. There are those characters in the video game where you can just keep shooting them, they just get back up, and they keep walking, and so forth. Yeah, and that's the mass. Consider that an idea of election, that's barring you having a view like Sacha Baron Cohen at the beginning of this pod, where you try to fit everybody into that 1%, that the majority of humanity is just so much NPCs, so many NPCs,
Hmm.
Just think about that, and these are the individuals who, if you take the great aggregate of them, they amount to essentially black velvet that the diamond of his elect can shine against the backdrop of. It's a very interesting thought. I don't know. Any other
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Now, but
that
as a
particular-
Christian, did you embrace that? Did that make you feel, as a Christian, did that make you feel more loved, more special, more grateful, more, because it's supposed to provoke that in you, right? It's supposed to produce that in you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's you can we'll get around to that in just a second. The
Okay.
egotism and the ethnocentrism and so forth that's inherent in this sort of way of believing, that it just
Yeah.
it comes out of it. But the next thing we should look at is how you find the reason why theologians and even the people who were writing the Bible, they ended up here as a result of the God who they found themselves worshiping. Because and this is a reoccurring theme. At some point, we have to label it and do a pod on that too. Just the idea that when you make this character up and it has these attributes, you are then forced to come to conclusions where you don't have answers, like in Romans 9:20, and you have to just be like, okay, you don't get the answer back to this God, because the conjunction. I remember Jonathan Edwards' diverse. The admirable conjunction of diverse excellencies. Well, you're only talking about the admirable ones. What about the other ones, the ignoble ones? What about the ignoble ones? So like we should consider the idea that these a doctrine like election is forced on us because of the Venn diagramish overlap of attributes that we ascribe to this deity. Speak on that, fellas.
Yeah, I've never heard that before, but I love the way it sounds, and I can just envision and imagine what you're talking about. These conversations have to take place, you said, because of the Venn diagramish nature, the overlap of these attributes, or as you said, these, what did you call them? These excellencies. Um, uh,
I said,
but if you have a God who
the
is
ignoble conjunction, because he said that admirable.
well, no, what was the original
of,
quote? Yeah,
Yeah, there's a
admirable
admirable
conjunction
of diverse excellencies in the person of Christ.
of diverse. Now, see, the key word is diverse in there. And what diverse is a euphemism for is competing. You have these competing excellencies, but you don't want to say that, so you call them diverse. So, for instance, you have a God who is all-knowing, yet a God who is, while he's all-knowing, he also has predetermined things. Now, if he's all-knowing and he's predetermined, but he also is gracious and love and good, and you have people who end up in hell, but he's predetermining things. Now you have these competing excellencies because he's also all powerful. So you're all knowing, you're all powerful, you're all good, you're all loving, and you're predetermining, and people end up in hell. How the hell does that happen? So now you've got that's where your Venn diagramish, these excellencies or these attributes. How are they going to fit together now? How are you going to explain how he knew this beforehand, and yet this undesirable result is still the result? He desires that none should perish, but people are perishing. So now you got to, okay, well, maybe it's our fault, but he's still sovereign, and so is that sort of what you're getting at here with these diverse excellencies?
Yeah. What say you, Albert? I see you smiling.
Oh no, I think Brady did a great job bringing that down. Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other than I think the problem is that the Venn diagram has the space where all the overlap happens, But you can't have. I think the problem with Christian thinking is that there isn't a dialectic tension in the way that we have thought of it, kind of in a philosophical sense. I think using the word, because a dialectic, essentially you're confirming that there is a contradiction, right? Whenever
they speak of paradox.
They speak of paradox,
often.
right? But a dialectic in the Hegelian sense, right? At least Hegel admitted that there are these contradictory propositions that can be made where you can form a synthesis at some point. But yeah, it's the overlap that's the problem, and it's the overlap that has to be, in my view, and how I'm how I'm oriented, at least. Like there has to be some level of technical working through that, and it's never given. So
yeah. Edwards' sermon on the excellency of Christ, what he does is he takes the seemingly disparate and paradoxical, what he labeled excellencies. You talk about the lamb's nature, and then you talk about a lion's nature, but you would say that the self-same individual is both a lion and a lamb. That's when because they're on the opposite ends, they're sort of polar opposites. But what happens when this is basically this is like a dispositional nuclear fusion. Like what happens? Like this, you get election. That's dispositional nuclear fusion, where you get these attributes that are just like so out there, and then next thing you know, when you put them together, okay, now we have this monstrosity. We have this thing, this really ugly thing that we have to deal with, where you come to realize that, man, he seems to be more characterized. I keep going back to that. That might be the high point, the summit of this podcast. That he's more characterized. It's more characteristic of him to be a God of hate and damnation than mercy and grace. That's the summit of this podcast. Is if you can actually bring yourself to, if you could see that, and if we're just talking in terms. I'm trying to anticipate, like Paul was anticipating, the people questioning him. I'm trying to anticipate what people would say. They would say, well, maybe because the mercy is totally undeserved, it overshadows the masses of people who are doomed. Somehow. I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of how a person would say that ends up overtaking this other larger portion. Like, just think of anybody you know. If you lied all the time and occasionally you told the truth, you would say the truth telling is the exception to the quote unquote rule. That we even have phrases in the English language for this.
Right.
But we don't need to tease this out anymore. But let's take a look at the ethnocentrism. And I think one way to introduce that would be that clip, Al, if you don't mind queuing that up, of the Dutch Reformed folks. Now, I'll just introduce this with, I'm not going to elaborate very much, but I'll just say that apartheid, which was a very ugly system in South Africa, many of the proponents of this way of living were actually Dutch Reformed people. We were just talking, was it on the presuppositionalist episode, we were talking about how many, like we speak of Bavinck, we speak of Van Til, we speak of Bonson. A lot of these names, if you look at it, they're Dutch. And so that this predestinarian and this predestinarian doctrine was embraced very wholeheartedly by people from within this culture largely. And it's interesting. Correlation does not imply causality, but it is interesting to note that in an area of the world where a lot of people believe this, look at the system that they had in place. And I think we'll just play this clip, and I'll just let you guys, first we should let you guys comment on it, and maybe we'll play the clip after. What do you guys think?
Oh no, I'd like to jump right into the clip. I think that's a great setup.
I think jump
Oh,
into
that's great. That's great.
The moderator of the Dutch Reformed Church, Dr. Nellis Janse van Rensburg, apologized for every aspect of apartheid, including the role the church played in strengthening, supporting, and upholding the destructive system. In an emotional sermon in the Moravian Church in the Overberg, Janse van Rensburg said not only did the church fail people of all color by the teachings, but he acknowledged that the suffering as a result of that continues to this day. SABC News reporter Mariska Botha has more for us.
We are coming to you from the Moravian Church in Genadendal, where this morning something both very emotional and very, very special took place. It was a service for Heritage Day, but it was also a momentous occasion where the Dutch Reformed Church came to the people of Genadendal, speaking to them about reconciliation. And the moderator of the Dutch Reformed Church, Dominee Nellis Janse van Rensburg, apologized for apartheid. Without wasting further time, let's speak to Dominee Janse van Rensburg. Dominee, thank you so much for joining us. We sat in on this church service and you were very emotional. What was it like for you to stand there and issue that apology?
You know, it's our faith. We believe that Christ's love compels us and moves us to reconcile to people. And having our own history of separation, and we played a significant role in that whole scenario of separation in South Africa. We are driven, and the love of Christ is of such a nature that it moves us. And we are well aware of what happened in Genadendal, the toll it took on the people here, on the Moravian Church, and for us it's only natural to come and say, we're sorry. We want to walk in the future, walk together, work together, live together, witness together. And we can only do that if we take the past serious, and therefore we repented so that we can move forward.
I just wanted to just show you guys, I remembered watching a video some years ago of a hate group, and it was a bunch of Reformed people. I can't remember how I found my way to that part of YouTube, but it was probably through looking at religious stuff when I was a Christian. And there were a bunch of Reformed Dutch people in South Africa who were just absolute racists. And I was like, wow. Because these were fellow Westminster folks, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, if you could could you do a little more to tie in these people and their experience, like what we just saw with what we've been talking about?
Well, this goes to the unfairness and to the idea that it often leads people to accept unfair systems. Like, for instance, when you go down, when you look to the 19th century, many of the people on the Confederate side of things were these Presbyterian Reformed folks and so forth. And the more Arminian folks were the abolitionists very often. So that's the way it connects to this. It's just to show that the consequences of these ideas are not just soteriological. They actually end up shaping the way you just think about life and society. They have sociological effects, is what I'm saying. Albert, you mind reading Westminster Confession part right there?
Here we go. Westminster Confession, chapter 3. Going to be reading a passage from there. That God must have decreed all future things is a conclusion which necessarily flows from his foreknowledge, independence, and immutability. The foreknowledge of God will necessarily infer a decree, for God cannot foreknow that things would be unless he had decreed they should be, and that because things would not be future unless he had decreed they should be. If God be an independent being, all creatures must have an entire dependence upon him, but this dependence proves undeniably that all their acts must be regulated by sovereign will. If God be of one mind, which none can change, he must have unalterably fixed everything in his purpose, which he effects in his providence.
So yeah, I think that's a good way to introduce how you're forced into certain things by the conjunction of the attributes. You see what I mean? So, so you can nix the point 6, the derived from ethnocentrism, if you want to, if you don't think that that's coherent enough.
No, I think I'd like to get into, because let's unless you have a different point, isn't this where we begin to talk about, like, isn't it like it's kind of uncanny that it's not just people in the modern world who flock to this, like, oh, pity us, but we are the chosen ones. Like, this comes from a place, from a biblical place, from an ethnocentrism in the Bible.
It's interesting, isn't it interesting that your Arminians were often the abolitionists, and it was the Reformed folks who were really the ones who were the slavers and so forth, you know? And it seems like everywhere you go in the world where there are people who believe certain things about God, there seems to be a correlated social attitude, you know? Like, so there's a certain kind of liberality that you find with the Arminians, and then with these Reformed folks, you will find, I gotta stop saying Reform, these Predestinarian folks or these Augustinian types, you will find this inequality that people are okay with. And I think it's endemic to believing in election, because you're okay with things not being equal on a soteriological level, which in their minds is the greatest level, right? So if you're okay with, on a soteriological level, things just being really unfair and uneven, is it incidental that on a sociological level that you would go ahead, Brady? I'm sensing you're getting ready to say something. What? Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking, at the risk of maybe getting us in trouble here, the reason why Paul could even talk that way about election and predestination and God choosing a people is because, isn't that the story that Israel told about themselves? God chose us out of the entire world. God revealed himself to us. He made us his people. He gave us a land. He gave us his blessing. He's going to send a Messiah through us. And depending on which passage of scripture you're in, the Messiah is for Israel and only for the world if the world comes to serve Israel. So there's a historical kernel in this idea of election. And I would argue that as the first century goes on and Jesus's failed messiahship becomes more and more evident, what the New Testament, the gospel writers do is they morph Jesus's physical kingdom into a spiritual one. Because the physical one's not happening, oh, well, it must be spiritual. And so now your soteriology, it all the more becomes man, it was about a specific people, but now that people is not going to be physical anymore, it's going to be spiritual. And that lends to this doctrine of election. So that, you know, here we are thousands of years later, still acting as if God has a people, but then the masses are going to miss out on this program.
But just consider if you're a person who's able to bring your brain, your mind to accept unfairness on this scale, is this like almost like the slippery slope? Does it make it easier for you to accept other kinds of unfairness in the world? So I guess you would say in the sermon, this would be the application. Yeah. Come on, somebody. This is the application of the sermon. Can I get an amen? if you agree that on the most important level of your being, that is your salvation, you know, that this kind of scheme can be in place, does it not follow? So this would be what you call an a fortiori argument. If that's the way it is on the larger scale, does it not follow that on smaller scales you would be also okay with inequality? And I just again I kept saying correlation doesn't imply causality, but I challenge people to look around and when they see injustice, look at some of the belief systems that people have, whether it's Christian or whatever else. And I think you'll often find that their belief systems help to legitimize and justify the inhumanity. But that's you know. I probably said that 3 times.
Yeah.
I think
let's move on.
No, Jay,
It's all good.
last thing I want to say, I think it's a compelling correlation that you're pointing out. If I were to push back a little bit on that, though, I almost feel
Please do.
Yeah, I think what tended to happen, and obviously this is not going to be, there's no way that I think, I'm not trying to state a general principle or a general relationship here, because I think the particulars are important. But so what we did get from Calvin, right, and when you look at the Protestant Reformation history, the countries and states that went more Protestant became more economically, they flourished more economically.
Good stuff.
Yeah,
good stuff.
and part of that was Calvin's philosophy of economics. Like he stressed, being able to gain capital, reap the benefits of labor, and things like that. So in a sense, I think the predestinarian theological milieu, I think, I guess in some ways has been coupled with this, this sense of capital, right? In certain countries, and the Dutch Reformed, I think what's interesting, the moment that the Netherlands became liberated from Spanish rule, they became a republic, but that's where the Dutch Reform kind of flourished in that environment, right? In that milieu, like even though they allowed more freedom of ideas to be there, and people, different religions to kind of coexist in that country. Not to say that the government was something else in terms of like how they tried to promulgate Christian ideas or everything down to like Abraham Kuyper, right, who tried to Christianize the nation despite the fact that it was a republic. But it's messy. But all I'm trying to say is that I do wonder that when it could be incidental that a lot of these countries and in America with Puritanism, that this idea of like exploitation essentially, right? Like when you it's not to say that your thesis isn't totally wrong or anything. I think it's interesting that we find that correlation there.
Well,
but,
it's not so much. I said it 3 times, so
Sure.
it probably sounds like a thesis, but it was
Right.
more just. And I was careful to bridle it by saying correlation never implies
I understand.
causality.
Right.
But it is worth. I don't. It might be worth looking at. Like if it might be worth taking a deep.
I think maybe the idea of election mixed with the idea of capital is maybe a dangerous mixture. That's a part of this, because we have. You're right. We have seen that over and over and over again. So
Yeah. I mean, you have the idea of manifest destiny, right? There's
Right.
this idea of we're God's chosen people, and it's our responsibility to bring His light to the world.
Exactly.
So you see that in other instances throughout history, explicitly stated.
Well, as we move forward to a conclusion, essentially, there is this idea of God utilizing us, or using creatures to maximize. Maybe maximize is the wrong word, but to glorify Himself, and how election plays a role in that. I think an interesting passage to look at would be Ephesians 1. You mind reading Ephesians 1, 11 through 12,
Sure.
Albert?
Yep. So Ephesians 1, 11.
I'm sorry. Can we go back further than that? Can we start around verse 4?
Sure.
Okay.
So verse 4 to 12. So Ephesians 1, verse 4 to 12. Even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has blessed us in the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he has lavished upon us, in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ, as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, so that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory.
Yeah, and this relates back to when the Westminster Confession in chapter 3, that reading there, where you see that they followed these ideas to their conclusion, but the idea is that you have, so this is interesting. You guys can push it. This is an extemporaneous thought here, but you have these attributes that are coming together and colliding, and they're creating this explosion. And then the question is there a telos? Like, is there a reason? Like, what's the guiding? Where is this going? It's one thing. Are you seeing what I'm saying? Like, I'm envisioning this in my head like a collision, but I'm saying if you have these attributes that this being has, and then they eventually just all collide, and we get this doctrine of election and double predestination, we have damnation from it, right? The natural question to arise from that is, well, for what? Like, it's almost, human beings are we look for reasons for things and patterns. So it's almost like I envision the theologian sitting down and seeing this collision of attributes and then saying, okay, we've got the gift wrapped, now we need a bow to put on top of the gift. Mm-hmm. Okay? So what do you guys, I don't want to, this is an extemporaneous thought, so I don't want to keep running with it, but what do you guys, where would you guys, I'm passing the baton, where are you guys taking this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little, what's kind of funny, I was reading through this and I just realized the whole thing is just a one run-on sentence. It's almost as if like Paul couldn't get enough out of his, it's funny reading this now, because reading this now, you look at it and he actually explains nothing. Like, there's nothing actually, it's just more, it's more like, if you talk about a bow, right? He's just trying to make this bow as big as possible and lavish.
It's like Trump. It's like Trump. It's gonna be fantastic.
It's gonna be amazing. It's gonna be fantastic. Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, strictly from Paul expounding on reasons to believe in this and anymore. That seems to be the case, and I can tell you back then when I was a Calvinist what my answer would have been, and it probably would have been to the effect of, God's sovereignty and power being known, because there's nothing when it comes to our salvation and others' damnation, right? It all points back to either kind of his wrath being expressed outwardly in that way, and then kind of inwardly through the second person of the Trinity in redemption. So you have this kind of very paradoxical kind of thing that I to me kind of gave me the goosebumps, I guess, in a sense, back then. So but that's not how Paul describes it. So let's go to an apostle, right? And he's he's essentially giving us a non-answer. So.
Yeah, when I hear that text, I'm initially struck by there's a lot of us and a lot of we in there. God did this for us so that he predestined us. He did all these things for us, to the praise of his glory. And when I was a believer, I think I was so happy to be caught up in that us that it never dawned on me that there's more people outside of that us than there is inside of it. There's more people outside of that we than there is inside of it. So anytime you couple the us with he predestined, he elected us so that we get these benefits, that immediately just says, oh, we're the ones. Whoever is not a part of that, they're not the ones. And this was God's great plan to glorify himself. In other words, for whatever reason, this great God could not have been seen as great or this great had he included all the others who are not part of the we. This was the way to get the glory that he so desired. Wow. Which is just sort of like, as a believer, I mean, I guess this is what we're worshiping. As a non-believer, I'm just looking back like, that's kind of sick. It's kind of sad that this is what it was going to take for you to get to be seen as great and glorious. That's just sort of a sucky thing to have a God who this is what he needs.
They just happen to be glass 1/10 full type individuals as opposed to 9/10 empty. That's a pretty bad joke, but people talk about, they focus on that 1/10 or that 0.05 or whatever, of fullness, as opposed to the masses that are being lost. And indeed, that's a run-on sentence that's meant to highlight how amazing it is to be in the boat after the Titanic sinks. Right. It's like, well, good luck to those guys, out there in the cold water. At least we made it into the life raft or whatever, Right. And it's so this is not to draw this on, but drag this on. But is it safe to say that Christianity can't survive without the out group? That it's almost a necessary feature of it that you. I mean, they go into all the world and evangelize, but a necessary feature of it is having large amounts of people who are not in. I wonder, and I also wonder if, like, I think of Malcolm X and his rally in Harlem making fun of white people and black people laughing, and you wonder if they were just doing that because they were oppressed. And this was a way to try to turn their oppression into something that was noble. You wonder if if you're a minority group and you're a cult, if you could turn being the picked on minority into a positive by talking about the fact that you're a chosen few. You see what I'm saying? So it's a way to flip something that would psychologically be something that gets you down, and you can turn it into something to glory in,
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to point 7, which is more or less the end of it. And we're we have two more, but this is we're examining the U in tulip. The tulip being the unfortunately, I have to apologize here. A disclaimer. It seems that we focus largely on predestinarian thought, but that's because the nature of this pod is election. This particular episode is about election, and you get most of the talk from the point of view of a predestinarian. But in the tulip, which is an acronym, standing for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, or some people reworded that so that it didn't sound perseverance or preservation
Yeah,
of the
they
saints.
changed it to
yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the I was changed to. It was irresistible grace. I can't remember what they changed it to. But the U in tulip is what we're focusing on, because we're examining whether or not it's capricious, is it incidental. Now, disclaimer here. I know generally Calvinists are going to tell you this. We're talking about the divine counsel. We're talking about something that God never articulates to us. He never condescends to give us an explanation. But what I'm going to ask is it really possible to both elect individuals under salvation and have it be unconditional if you're all-knowing? Now, maybe we need to define unconditional here. This is such a laborious pod here. But unconditional being that, unlike what Augustine believed before 360 whatever AD, when they said that he chose you because he foresaw what you were going to, 369, and he foresaw you choosing him, and then he changed his view. Well, unconditional will be on the other side, 370 AD for Augustine, where apparently he must have switched over to the you here, where it's not that he saw anything in you. And this is a way for them to make, that's why they call tulip the doctrines of grace. They say, is to empty human beings of anything meritorious. Go ahead. What were you saying, Brady?
No, I'm sorry. It was 396, not 369.
Okay, 396. Okay, so we said 396. So 397. He's on the U now. So unconditional. That is to say, now what does it mean for something to be unconditional? If it's truly unconditional, is it capricious? But how could it be capricious if he actually chose individuals? How could you say, this relates to the previous idea of maximizing his glory? How could you be calibrating things in such a way that you gain maximum glory and anything be capricious in the process? These are just thoughts, throwing them out there, but it seems to me that the U in tulip, or the unconditionality of a person's election, that is to say that there is nothing, and when we speak of merit, we even speak of demerit. It's not that you were so bad that you were necessary to his plan of election, or that you were so good. That is to say that you've been emptied of any agency in his choice of you. Is that possible for you to do that and simultaneously be making conscientious choices of individuals that will, the aggregate of which will result in the maximal glory for oneself?
Well, the Calvinists might say, in a way that we didn't choose, let's say, the parents we have or the children we have, but we have been kind of given those things, and well, I guess it wouldn't be the same actually, because you're not choosing unconditionally, but they might.
If you're a necessary component,
if
you're a necessary component in him maximizing his glory, how is it that you are simultaneously unconditionally elected?
The Calvinists might argue
it could
that,
be one way is
go ahead.
I was going to say, one way could be if the individual people who are chosen don't matter. What matters more is the number of people, the small number, not the specific ones. So it could be unconditional in that sense of he could have chosen, let's say.
So is it capricious? That's the question.
The choice of people, yes, in the sense that it doesn't matter who. Let's just say let's say only in the course of human history, only 10 million people will ever be saved. But it didn't matter which 10 million. The capriciousness is, I'm just going to blindly, as if an all-knowing God could blindly choose Um, I'm going to blindly choose
But
10 million. It could have been a different
can
10
you
million.
speak of?
I would have still gotten maximum glory.
So it seems that you're equating maximum glory numerically, though. You're saying that it's a matter of addition, essentially.
Well, no, what I'm saying is whatever maximum glory is, it's not based on the who, it's based on the how many, but not like.
But that's a number. That's this addition.
Well, it may not necessarily be the number as much as it is. I am talking about quantity, but I'm not talking about a specific number. I'm talking about the minority versus the majority. The black backdrop needs to be big enough to showcase my grace on a smaller contingent. It could have been 999,999. Doesn't have to be 10 million.
I still don't think that frees you from the.
It's that the saved contingent is smaller.
I still don't think that frees you from the caprice of it in terms of the individual. But you should feed into this, Albert, some, because it looks like your wheels are spinning.
So no, I'm trying to come up with. I'm trying to put my mindset back into the.
I love it. I got
Yeah.
him thinking like a Christian.
No, yeah, you got me thinking like, yeah. So I mean, we don't know the reasons, right? We don't know the reasons why he chose us. There were unconditional.
But this is that's the nature of the question. Mm-hmm. If there is a reason, if there is any reason, is it possible for there to simultaneously be a reason and it to be unconditional and it's unconditional? That's a question. I'm not saying that I disagree or anything. I'm just saying this is a worthy thing to ponder. Because I think a lot of times people throw around the unconditional thing and they don't really think deeply about what that actually means.
So here's what the Calvinists may say, right? Is that it's unconditional purely on any act, will, desire that I would have ever had, God would have ever had foreknowledge about me. So it's not regarded in that, and it has no regard in his decision making. Why he chose me.
Mm-hmm. But somehow so we're talking about them in terms of it's not a meritocracy,
right?
That it's not based on anything that you've but also unconditional. It's not based on your demerit either, by that same statement. So it's not like, oh, you were so bad. It's not because, remember, it's not because you were the greatest of all the nations or that you're the smallest. He set his love on you because he did it, right? So are we saying that it's capricious? Is it willy-nilly? Is it arbitrary?
So I think
we don't have to dwell here long.
I think the answer that the Calvinists would try to say is no, it's not capricious. It's not on a whim. It's not because once again, it's they wouldn't have a basis to say that, right? But but they would argue yes. So it's not capricious. It's intentional for whatever reason that we have no idea why. But it's not based on anything that I'd done.
But you play an integral role in this matter because you're
sure
you add to this maximum kind of glory scheme here in some way. I don't know. I just think it's very interesting. I know that we're going to have the Reformed theologians jump in the comment section and try to roast us for even pondering this, but I would challenge them to actually try to think about that a little. Just take a U-turn.
So Jay Witt, just to clarify, so you believe that any reason that God may have is a contingent reason, meaning the reason why he chose.
I feel like you're in a conundrum. I feel like you end up in a conundrum when you're saying you're choosing people and you're doing it in knowledge and that you're maximizing your glory, and then that simultaneously there is no merit in them, or I'm not even wording this right, that they don't contribute an important element to this whole scheme. Because however insignificant a thing is, it's like a puzzle or something where, I used to watch plane crash videos on YouTube, and I will never forget, it would be just like a screw that wasn't put in right, or it was the wrong screw, and the next thing you know, all of these people lose their lives. And I'm just thinking that in terms of election, like, however insignificant this person is, if they play a role in, if they're that screw on that airplane, and it's important that they are there so that the airplane takes the wing, and it's and the glory is maximized, even though they are in themselves quite insignificant, they contribute to the aggregated like whole. You see what I mean? Right. And in such a way that they are a necessary component of this maximized glory. But I don't want us to, I know, Brady, hopefully you're not getting tired of this. Brady, you tired of this?
No, I'm thinking about all the different ways to try to slice this, and because, see, I think what makes me so frustrated is, I think a lot of times Christians would say, almost like Paul says at the end of Romans 11, right? Who has known the mind of God, or who has been his counselor? These things are just above our pay grade. But really it's not, because we're trying to get into the mind of a all-wise God, and we can't plumb the depths of this God. We really are trying to we're trying to harmonize the imaginings.
We're the hot mic, remember
men,
that.
the diverse imaginings of men.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just saying, like, why this is so difficult to try to split this hair is because these are not the hairs on the gray head of an old God. These are the hairs of men. And that's why it's just so difficult to even have this conversation.
But that's a great place to move on to the next thing, which is the last thing, and it has to do with the chosen one myth. The chosen one myth. And so we're tying things up really neatly, because we're returning to the top of the pod where we talked about the prosecutor's fallacy, and how people were like, why would you come up with this belief? Human beings, this had to come from heaven, because this is so unlike human beings that it's not. Human beings they don't have ingenuity. There's no way they could come up with something like this. This had to. You know what? The pyramids were built by aliens. The pyramids were built it had to be built by aliens, because we don't have that. They didn't have that technology. So human beings couldn't think of this. Religion is so complex, and the trigonometry and all kinds of things involved in it, that it couldn't be the product of Stone Age human beings or Bronze Age human beings. And likewise, the chosen one myth is such a unique thing. The idea of an election, this is so unique. This is from God. What are you talking about? This is from God. Like, nobody's going to come up with the idea where millions of people are excluded, or are they? Let's take a look at that. Just thinking, Albert sort of spoiler alert earlier. He mentioned the Matrix, but need we say more? Superman. Almost if you look at our great myths, which you find in comic books and so forth nowadays, you will find, and not only in comic books, you have the idea of the soulmate. You have the idea of destiny. You people regularly use and think of life in this kind of way. Is it improbable that if we, on an individual level, often think of our lives as having a telos, or having some sort of meaning, and having, I was just destined, this is my calling. You heard people say that. They're not even religious. They're talking about their profession. Vocation. It basically means calling, essentially. Like, and people think of their lives, and this is in colloquial language that people regularly think of. So is it that unlikely that when they come together to build a religion, that this would be baked into the religion too? Think about it. What are you guys' thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I go back to what I said a while ago about, just Israel seeing themselves as chosen by God. I mean, I think it's baked into the history of the religion, not just the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you have to say, Albert?
Yeah, the uniqueness of this idea of being the chosen, fulfilling a destiny, etc. When you look at other myths, right? Obviously, they have the same concepts, happening. You have the hero myths of Hercules, and Eastern religions have, mythologies have the same kind of thing. So it's a little perplexing why, in a sense, we're having debates about it from like a theological perspective. But I think what's kind of interesting is, it's all. I was listening to Joseph Campbell the other day, and he was talking more or less about the Christ myth being about you, right? It's actually has nothing to do with an external God per se, and that we all go through these transformations, right? The death and resurrection is symbolic of this transformation from the animal being into the spiritual being, or the being that has heart and flesh and blood, and compassion, right? So he tied it all back to how, in a lot of old mythologies, that transformation happened from, like, when you become a child to an adult, right? You become a very dependent kind of being into, a very independent being with authority, right? And that's all explained through kind of the hero myth, right? The baptism into something, and that transformation into something else. So, that I think those are, when you think about it in terms of like more of an antiquated concept, right? Like in a world that doesn't have science or anything that we would consider modern, right? They derived meaning and they infuse meaning into, how they experienced life from in a much more primitive way. To me, it's a lot more of a, makes a lot more sense, right? As an explanation for why these concepts are built into religion, especially into Christianity as well.
Yeah.
So,
basically every Christian has their own. Each Christian is what Neo off of the Matrix. Like you can look to your life and think. I think of there's an old gospel song that says, "Without him, I would be nothing. I'd be like a ship without a sail." Or there was a Christian rap that said, "This is my new life. He gave me a reason to live." And you can think the election thing is ultimately about. Yeah, it has there's a lot of collateral damage. there's a heck of a lot of collateral damage. A whole lot of people who end up just going to hell so that I can be elect. But at the end of the day, if I'm elect, it makes it worthwhile for entire civilizations to have gone to hell. So like for me to consider whole civilizations NPCs, like Red Cloud talked about that on the last episode where, you got all of these people who have their beliefs about the cosmos and they have their own deities. It's fine to consign all of them to hell so that at the end of the day, I can be Neo in the Matrix. and because that gives me some meaning in my life. Because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have.
Wow.
The flip side of that rap lyric is, I have a new life and now I have a reason to live. Well, the flip side is I don't have a reason to live. Well, guess what? You don't need a reason to live. You're already alive. Like, you're alive. You don't need a quote unquote reason to live. You're living already.
Yeah.
But if you think of life in that way, then sure, you'll find that you need a reason for it, you know? So anyway, I'll turn it back over to Brady and let him close this out.
No, I think that's I'm gonna probably have it close out on that note. I'll just add, hey, anybody who's made it this far in the pod, definitely want to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you? What questions would you have about this topic? What didn't we address? And yeah, definitely leave your comments, like, subscribe. We need that, and stick with us. Many more good episodes coming. Thank you, fellas, for your time tonight. This was banging.